My name is Robert Calloway. I'm 44, and I've spent the last 16 years auditing pension funds for a mid-sized actuarial firm, which is a polite way of saying I get paid to notice when someone has quietly moved numbers around to make a result look better than it actually is. I was sitting across from my own divorce attorney on a Thursday afternoon in October, looking at a financial disclosure my wife's lawyer had just filed, and for the first time in my career, the numbers in front of me weren't someone else's problem to solve. They were mine. "She's asking for the house outright," Gerald Whitlow said, sliding the document across the table like it was something that might bite. "The car. And 50% of your pension, structured as a qualified domestic relations order." I didn't say anything for a moment. I was doing the thing I always do when a number doesn't sit right, running it backward, checking what assumptions would have to be true for this to make sense. "She doesn't even know," I said finally. "Doesn't know what?" "That Emily already told the evaluator she wants to live with me." Gerald looked up from the file. "You're sure about that?" I was. I'd read the line in Dr. Marsh's preliminary notes 3 times the night before, in my rental apartment, sitting at a kitchen table that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. "The minor child has expressed a clear and consistent preference to reside primarily with the father." 11 words. They'd rearranged the entire shape of the fight I thought I was walking into. "She's building her whole negotiating position on an assumption," I said. "And the assumption's wrong." Gerald leaned back in his chair, the particular stillness of a man who'd seen 100 divorces and had stopped being surprised by any of them. "Then I'd suggest we let her find that out the hard way. Sometimes the best move is just to let someone walk into the room they built." I looked at the disclosure again, the house, the car, half a pension I'd spent 16 years accumulating one quarterly statement at a time. 3 months earlier, I would have read this document as theft. Now I read it as something closer to a miscalculation, the kind I used to find buried in other people's spreadsheets, a number that looked solid until you checked the one assumption holding the whole thing up. But to understand how we got to that conference room, with a teenage girl's quiet preference about to upend everything her mother had built a legal strategy around, I have to go back almost 2 years, to a Tuesday evening in our kitchen in Ashford Hills, back when the biggest disagreement Diane and I had was about whether to repaint the dining room a color she called warm sage and I called the color of old hospital walls. I want to tell you who I was before any of this, because the man sitting in Gerald's office that October afternoon, calmly dismantling his own divorce settlement with the same detachment he'd bring to a fraud case, was not the man I'd been for most of my marriage. That man took a long time to die, and Diane, in her own way, helped kill him, though it would be dishonest to say I didn't hand her the knife myself, more than once, without ever noticing I'd done it. Diane and I met 19 years before that afternoon in Gerald's office, at a friend's housewarming party in a part of town neither of us could afford anymore by the time things fell apart. She worked sales even then, pharmaceutical territory, before she moved into medical supply distribution a few years into our marriage, and she had the particular gift good salespeople have, of making you feel like the most interesting person in a crowded room for exactly as long as she needed you to feel that way. I didn't think of it as a skill she was using on me. I thought of it as falling in love, and for a long time, I think that's mostly what it was. We bought the house in Ashford Hills 6 years into the marriage, after Emily was born, a 4-bedroom colonial on a street with mature oak trees and a homeowners association that cared more about mailbox height than seemed reasonable. Diane picked the house. I picked the mortgage company, because I was the one who understood amortization schedules and she trusted me to handle anything that involved a spreadsheet. That division of labor felt natural at the time. Looking back, it was the first quiet agreement we made about which parts of our life belonged to which of us, and neither of us ever revisited it, even as the things that belonged to each category started to matter more than either of us admitted. I worked long hours. Not unusual hours for my field, but long enough that I missed things, recitals that started at 6 when I didn't leave the office until 6:15, a handful of parent-teacher conferences Diane attended alone because a client needed a report finalized by Friday. I told myself, and told Diane, that I was providing for us in the way that mattered most, and for years she didn't push back hard enough for me to question whether providing and being present were actually the same thing. I see now that I'd built an entire identity around the idea that they were, because the alternative, that I might be failing at the second one while succeeding at the first, was not a thought I had any interest in sitting with. There's one scene from those early years I keep coming back to, because it's the one that makes the rest of this story mean something, rather than just being a recitation of grievances. Emily was 6. We'd driven up to a lake house Diane's family used to rent every August, and on the second night, a storm knocked the power out for 6 hours. Diane found candles in a kitchen drawer, and the three of us sat on the porch in the dark, eating cereal straight from the box because the stove didn't work, and Diane told Emily a long, improvised story about a lake monster who was secretly just lonely and wanted someone to play cards with. Emily laughed so hard she nearly fell off the porch swing. I remember watching Diane's face in the candlelight, mid-story, completely present in a way I associated, even then, with the best version of who she was, unguarded, a little goofy, entirely focused on the two of us instead of on closing a deal or managing a calendar. I married that version of her. For a long time, I believed that version was who she actually was, underneath the sales pitches and the travel schedule, and that the travel and the late nights were just the costume she had to wear for work. I think now that both versions were real, and the tragedy of the marriage, if there was a single one, is that I never figured out how to make her feel safe enough to bring the lake house version home more often. The first thing that didn't quite fit came almost 14 years into the marriage, the spring Emily turned 14 herself, a charge on our joint credit card statement that I noticed only because I happened to be reconciling our accounts for taxes that month. $89 a month, recurring, to a self-storage facility 40 minutes outside town. Neither of us had ever mentioned needing storage space. I brought it up over dinner, the way you ask about something you assume has a boring explanation, because most explanations, in my experience auditing other people's finances, usually are boring. What's this storage unit charge? I asked, not even looking up from my plate. Furniture from my mom's place, Diane said. We don't have room for it here. I keep meaning to tell you, it's just been sitting there. 14 months. She shrugged, the particular shrug of someone who has already decided this conversation isn't worth the energy it would take to be defensive about it. I'll deal with it eventually. Probably just donate it all. I let it go. I want to be honest about exactly how I let it go, not because the explanation was airtight, but because I had, by that point in our marriage, developed a habit of accepting the first reasonable-sounding answer to any question I asked her, the same way you stop double-checking a colleague's work once you've decided to trust them. I extended Diane a kind of professional courtesy I would never have extended an actual client, and I told myself that courtesy was the same thing as love. Looking back, that was the first sign. I just didn't have a file open on it yet. The pattern, once it started, didn't announce itself. It accumulated the way sediment accumulates, invisible day to day, undeniable once you finally look at the whole riverbed at once. Diane's travel schedule shifted that spring, the way these things shift, in increments small enough to dismiss individually. An extra overnight here. A regional conference that ran a day longer than the one the year before. I noticed the changes the same way I noticed irregularities in a pension fund's quarterly filings, not as evidence of anything, just as data points that would eventually need to be reconciled against something, someday, when I had time to actually look. I didn't make time. That's the flaw at the center of everything that follows, and I want to name it plainly instead of letting it hide inside the story the way I let it hide inside my marriage for over a year. I had every tool necessary to see what was happening, and I declined to use any of them, because using them would have required me to admit that something needed to be seen. In April, driving back from a client meeting 2 towns over, I passed the storage facility, pure coincidence, nothing more, just a building on the way home that happened to be the one Diane had mentioned, and saw her car in the lot. Mid-afternoon, on a day she told me she had a sales meeting 40 miles in the opposite direction. I didn't stop. I didn't call her. I drove home, made dinner, and said nothing, because saying something meant admitting I'd been checking, and checking meant admitting that some part of me no longer believed the furniture story I'd accepted without question a year earlier. She told me later what she was thinking in those months, after everything came apart. This is what she said. I told myself it wasn't really lying, the storage unit thing. It started as something small, a place to keep gifts before birthdays, things I didn't want Robert to find before I was ready to give them. Trevor and I weren't anything yet, not really, not in April. We were just two people who kept ending up at the same conferences, complaining about the same territory managers. The storage unit became something else gradually, the way everything became something else gradually that year. I remember driving away from it that day and seeing a car that looked like Robert's 2 streets over and feeling my stomach drop for 10 full seconds before I realized it wasn't him. I told myself that fear meant I should stop. I didn't stop. I told myself I'd stop after the conference season ended. I'm back in the kitchen now, that same spring, the version of me that didn't know any of this yet. Emily was the one who handed me the next piece, the way kids hand you things, without understanding the weight of what they're carrying. We were in the car, driving back from her orthodontist appointment, and she mentioned, casually, that Mom had been picking her up from school on some Wednesdays in a different car, not ours, something newer, dark blue, that belonged to Mom's friend Trevor from the conference circuit. Trevor who? I asked, trying to sound like a man asking out of mild curiosity rather than a man whose chest had just gone tight. I don't know. Some guy from her work conferences. He's fine, I guess. Kind of boring. How many Wednesdays? She shrugged, the exact shrug her mother used when a conversation had stopped being interesting to her. I don't know, Dad. A few. Why does it matter? I told her it didn't, and I changed the subject to her braces, and I drove the rest of the way home with both hands tight on the wheel, running the same calculation over and over. A few Wednesdays could mean 2. It could mean a dozen. I had no idea which, and not knowing which was its own kind of information, the kind that tells you you've stopped being someone who's informed about his own family's schedule. I called it networking, in my head, for about a week. I wouldn't call it that anymore, not once the rest of the pieces started arriving. I started doing, almost without deciding to, what I do professionally. I requested 2 years of our joint credit card statements under the cover of Getting Our Finances Organized for Tax Season, which Diane accepted without question, because she had no reason yet to suspect I was looking for anything beyond deductions. I cross-referenced the storage facility charges against her reported travel calendar, the one she kept in a shared app, so I'd know which nights to expect her home and which nights I wouldn't. 6 times in 14 months, the charges and the calendar didn't reconcile. 6 times, she'd told me she was in one city while her card was being used at a gas station or a coffee shop 40 minutes from our own house. I am a man who reads inconsistency for a living. I had spent 16 years getting paid specifically to notice exactly the kind of pattern I was now finding in my own household, and it had taken me the better part of a year to even open the file in earnest. I hadn't put together the full shape of it yet. But the part of me trained to read ledgers for a living already had, and it was no longer willing to be talked back down by the explanations I kept offering myself on its behalf. The first crack of real certainty came on a Tuesday in late May, not from anything Diane said or did, but from something she stopped doing. For as long as I could remember, she'd had a habit, almost a tic, of reaching for my hand under the table at restaurants, unconsciously, mid-conversation, the way you reach for something familiar without thinking about it. Sometime that spring, without my noticing exactly when, she stopped. We went to dinner for our anniversary, 19 years, and her hand stayed in her lap the entire meal, folded, and I sat there trying to remember the last time she'd reached for mine, and I couldn't. That was the moment I stopped being able to explain it away. Not the storage unit, not Trevor's name, not the 6 unreconciled charges. A hand that used to reach for mine and no longer did. It wasn't proof of anything a court would recognize. It was proof enough for me. I hired Patricia Goss in the first week of June. I'd worked with her professionally twice before, on cases involving suspected asset concealment in divorce-related pension disputes, and I trusted her the way I trust very few people in my field, because she was slow, methodical, and entirely uninterested in telling clients what they wanted to hear. I need you to look at a pattern of charges, I told her, sitting in her small office above a dry cleaner's, sliding a folder across her desk. before I decide what to do about anything. She looked through the folder for a long time without saying anything, which I'd learned was her version of taking someone seriously. This storage unit, she finally said. You said it's under her name? Her maiden name. Technically still legal, I think, even though she hasn't used it in 19 years. That's not nothing, she said. People don't usually reach for an old name by accident. She came back to me 3 weeks later with more than I'd asked for, sitting across from me at a coffee shop because she preferred not to discuss findings over email. The storage unit wasn't storing furniture. The facility's access logs, which she'd obtained through channels I didn't ask too many questions about, showed entries that didn't correspond to any furniture moving pattern at all: quick visits, 15 to 20 minutes, several times a month, almost always around midday. There's something else, she said, and I could tell from the careful flatness in her voice that this was the part she'd been building toward. A separate checking account. Opened about 18 months ago, under her maiden name. Fed by small, regular transfers, 200 here, 300 there, coming out of what I'm assuming are your joint accounts. How much total? Just under $11,000. Accumulated slowly enough that I don't think anyone reviewing your joint statements casually would have flagged any single transfer as unusual. I sat with the number for a long moment, doing the kind of mental math I do automatically, the way some people can't help counting ceiling tiles. $11,000, moved in increments small enough to be invisible, over 18 months, almost exactly the same window of time as the storage unit visits, the missed reconciliations, the hand that had stopped reaching for mine at the dinner table. Trevor Ashby, Patricia said, sliding a printed page across the table, a professional headshot, the kind companies use on their website staff pages. Regional sales director for one of your wife's competitors. Same industry conferences, same trade show circuit, overlapping territory for the last 3 years, as far as I can tell. I looked at his face for longer than I needed to. He looked unremarkable in the specific way that made the whole thing feel even more surreal, not a dramatic rival, not someone with an obvious charisma I could resent cleanly. Just a man in a navy suit with an easy, forgettable smile, the kind of face you'd pass in an airport without registering twice. She told me later about the account, once there was nothing left to protect by hiding it. This is what she said. I opened the account after the promotion went to someone else, someone with less tenure, less of a track record, just better timing and a better relationship with the regional VP. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage after that meeting, doing math in my head about what I actually had, separate from Robert, separate from the house, separate from 19 years of joint everything. The number scared me. I told myself I'd just build a small cushion, nothing dramatic, just enough that I wouldn't be starting completely from zero if anything ever changed. I told myself it had nothing to do with Trevor at first. By the time it did have something to do with Trevor, I'd already gotten used to having something that was only mine, and I didn't want to give that feeling up, even after I understood exactly what it had become. That's where I was, that June, while Robert was 3 towns over with a private investigator's report I didn't know existed yet. I drove home that evening and didn't say anything. I made dinner. I helped Emily with a geometry worksheet at the kitchen table, the same table where, a few weeks later, I would lay out everything Patricia had found and watch my wife's face do something I'd never seen it do before. I want to be honest about what I did with the information in the days immediately after Patricia gave it to me, because it's not flattering, and I think it matters. I didn't confront Diane that week. I didn't confront her the following week either. I kept making her coffee every morning and setting it on the counter exactly where I always had. I told myself I was being careful, building a complete picture before I acted, the same discipline I'd bring to any fraud case at work. The truth is closer to this. Some part of me understood that the moment I said any of it out loud, the marriage would end, formally and irreversibly, and I wasn't ready to be the one who ended it, even with $11,000 and a storage unit and a man named Trevor Ashby sitting in a folder on my desk. I had confused gathering proof with avoiding the conversation the proof demanded. Those are not the same instinct, even though for weeks I told myself they were. The moment I finally understood the full shape of what I was holding came on a Sunday morning in mid-June, alone in my car in the firm's parking lot, having driven there on a weekend for no real reason except that I needed somewhere that wasn't the house. I sat with Patricia's full report open on my laptop, the access logs, the bank statements, Trevor Ashby's forgettable face, and I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. It was closer to the feeling of finally closing a fraud case after months of work, not satisfaction, exactly. Just the quiet, heavy certainty of having found the number that explained everything else. I gave Diane one chance before I did anything else, and I want to be precise about why, because it matters to how the rest of this story unfolded. Some part of me, the part that had spent 16 years giving clients the benefit of the doubt right up until the moment the numbers made doubt impossible, needed to know whether she would tell me herself, unprompted, if I simply created the space for her to do it. I arranged for Emily to spend a Sunday afternoon at her friend Madison's house, and I waited until Diane and I were alone in the kitchen before I asked her, as plainly as I could manage, whether there was anything she wanted to tell me about the past year and a half. She looked up from the laundry she was folding, and I watched her face do the specific thing faces do when a person is deciding, in real time, whether to lie. A small pause. A flicker of calculation behind otherwise composed features. I'd seen that exact look on the faces of people across a conference table from me at work, moments before they decided to keep lying rather than start telling the truth. "What kind of thing?" she said. "Any kind of thing, Diane. I'm not going to lead you to it. I'm asking you directly." She folded one more shirt before she answered, which told me, more than anything she eventually said, that she was using the motion to buy herself time. "Things have been hard between us for a while," she said. "I don't know if that's the kind of thing you mean." "It's not," I said. "I already know about the storage unit. I know it's under your maiden name. I know about the account with $11,000 in it. I know about Trevor." I watched something leave her face when I said his name, not surprise, exactly. Something closer to the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told they no longer have to pretend they aren't carrying it. She asked how I'd found out. Not whether it was true. How I'd found out. That answered the larger question before she ever answered it directly, the way it always does, the way it had with every fraud case I'd ever closed, where the first real tell wasn't a denial, but a question about exposure instead of truth. "It started at a conference about 18 months ago," she said, sitting down across from me at the table, the laundry abandoned in its basket. "I'd just been passed over for the regional VP promotion. Someone with half my experience got it because he golfed with the right people. I was angry in a way I didn't know how to put down, and Trevor noticed, and he said something about it that nobody else had bothered to say. It wasn't about you. It started as not being about you, anyway. And the account?" She was quiet for a moment. "After it became something, I started thinking about what I actually had, separate from this house, separate from everything we'd built together. The number scared me. I told myself I was just building a cushion, in case anything ever changed." "In case what changed, Diane?" She didn't answer that one directly, and her silence was its own answer, the kind I'd learned to read as clearly as any printed statement. I asked her one more question, because I'd promised myself going into that kitchen that I would only need one. I already had the facts, I needed the thing the facts alone couldn't tell me. "Were you planning to leave before I found out, or only after?" "I honestly don't know," she said, and for the first time in the conversation, her voice cracked slightly, in a way that felt less performed than anything else she'd said. "Some days I thought I'd keep the account and just stay, and never tell you, and let it be the one thing that was only mine. Other days I'd already pictured the apartment. I don't know which version of me was the real one. Maybe neither was." I sat with that answer longer than I sat with any of the documents Patricia had given me. There's a kind of honesty that's almost worse than a clean confession, because it doesn't give you anywhere to direct your anger, it just leaves you holding the genuine uncertainty of another person's heart, which turns out to be a much heavier thing to hold than a lie. My flaw, the one I'd carried through the whole marriage, surfaced one last time in that kitchen, in a form I hadn't expected, even with everything Patricia had found, even with Trevor Ashby's forgettable face sitting in a folder in my car, some part of me was still hoping Diane would say something that made all of it make sense in a way that didn't require the marriage to end. I sat there waiting for an explanation that would let me keep believing in the lake house, the candles, the porch swing, 19 years that had felt, for most of their length, genuinely real. She didn't give me that explanation, because there wasn't one to give. What she gave me instead was the truth, delivered without much drama, which turned out to be its own kind of mercy and its own kind of devastation at the same time. "I think I need some time to think," I told her, which was the only sentence I managed to get out that didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. I drove to a hotel that night, the first of several nights I'd spent away from a house I still technically lived in, and I sat in a room with bad carpeting and a view of a parking lot, and I understood, finally and completely, that whatever hope I'd been quietly nursing through Patricia's entire investigation had just been spent. I wasn't waiting to be wrong anymore. I was deciding what to do about being right. What I did next, I did quietly, and I did it the way I do everything professionally, methodically, with documentation, without raising my voice once. I called Gerald Whitlow the morning after the hotel, before I'd even had coffee, and asked him to start the paperwork. Not out of vengeance, I want to be careful about that distinction, because I spent a long time afterward making sure it was actually true and not just a story I was telling myself. I filed because there was nothing left to investigate. The file was closed. All that remained was the part of the process that turns a closed file into a legal fact. I moved into the guest room first, then into a small rental 2 miles from the house once Diane and I agreed, in one of the few conversations that month that didn't end in either silence or tears, that Emily shouldn't have to absorb the upheaval all at once. We told her together, sitting on either side of her at the kitchen table, using language we'd rehearsed separately and then awkwardly merged the night before. She took it the way I imagine most 14-year-olds take it, quieter than I expected, asking fewer questions than I'd braced for, retreating to her room afterward with a kind of controlled composure that worried me more than crying would have. "Are you and Mom getting a divorce because of something I did?" she asked me a few days later, out of nowhere, while we were driving to volleyball practice. "No," I said, more firmly than almost anything else I said that whole month. "This has nothing to do with you. I need you to hear that clearly, and I need you to keep hearing it, even on days when it doesn't feel true." She nodded, looking out the window, and didn't say anything else about it for almost 2 weeks. The divorce filing went in that September, slower to start than either of us expected, faster to escalate than I was prepared for once Diane retained Carol Reyes. I'd heard Carol's name before, professionally. She had a reputation for being thorough and unsentimental, the kind of attorney who treated every negotiation as a number to be optimized rather than a relationship to be mourned. Her opening position, delivered through Gerald in a folder I read 3 times before I could make myself stop rereading it, asked for the house outright, the newer of our 2 cars, and 50% of my pension structured as a qualified domestic relations order that would follow me into retirement regardless of anything else in the settlement. I sat with that request for several days before I felt anything coherent about it. My first reaction wasn't anger, which surprised me. It was something closer to professional recognition, the specific feeling I get at work when I see a number that's technically defensible but built on an assumption nobody has bothered to verify. "She's positioning Emily as a fixed variable," I told Gerald, during one of our strategy sessions, the 2 of us going through the disclosure line by line. "The house request only makes sense if she's assuming primary custody. She hasn't actually asked Emily anything. She's just assumed." "You said the custody evaluation's already underway?" "Dr. Marsh met with Emily twice. I haven't seen the report yet." Gerald was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man calculating odds he didn't want to overpromise on. "Then we wait," he said. "We don't preempt anything. We let the evaluation speak before we counter. I want to tell you about the wife's POV moment that belongs here, because I learned about it much later, and it changed how I understood that entire period of waiting." She told me, much later, what it felt like on her end while the evaluation was underway. This is what she said. "I assumed Emily would say she wanted to stay with me. I didn't even think of it as an assumption at the time, it felt like a fact, the kind you don't double-check, the way you don't double-check that the sun will come up. I'd been the one who went to every school event Robert missed for work. I'd been the one who knew her friends' names, her teachers, the specific way she liked her eggs. I built the entire settlement request around that certainty without once sitting down and asking her, directly, what she actually wanted, because some part of me was afraid that asking would make the certainty less certain. I think I knew, somewhere underneath all of it, that I hadn't actually been as present as I was telling myself I'd been. I just didn't want to find out for sure before I had to. I'm back with Robert now, the week the evaluator's report finally arrived. The report came in early October. Dr. Marsh's language was clinical, careful, the kind of writing designed to withstand cross-examination. But the core finding sat in a single sentence I've already told you about, the one I read 3 times in my rental apartment the night before my meeting with Gerald. The minor child has expressed a clear and consistent preference to reside primarily with the father, citing his consistent presence at extracurricular and academic events, his direct involvement in day-to-day support, and a perceived contrast in availability between the two parents. I sat with that sentence for a long time. 14 years of believing I'd confused providing for being present, and somewhere underneath all that confusion, apparently, I had still managed to be present enough for it to matter, not perfectly, not without real gaps, but enough. I learned, through the professional courtesy attorneys sometimes extend each other, that Carol Reyes had been blindsided when she read the same report. Not upset in a way that suggested she'd expected to lose this particular point. Upset in a specific way that suggests a person has just discovered an entire load-bearing assumption in their strategy was never actually load-bearing at all. The settlement negotiations that followed bore almost no resemblance to Carol's opening position. Emily's stated preference, weighted heavily given her age and the clarity of her reasoning, became the foundation the rest of the agreement got built around. I retained primary physical custody, with a standing schedule for regular time with her mother. The house, which suddenly meant something different to Diane once it was clear Emily wouldn't be the one living in it day to day, went from a non-negotiable demand to a point we settled by agreeing to sell it and split the proceeds. The car stayed with Diane, uncontested. It had never really been the actual point of the fight. The pension division held in principle, though Gerald negotiated the percentage down meaningfully, citing the discovered hidden account and the 18 months of diverted joint funds, which the court did, in the end, way more than Gerald had initially predicted it would. The night the settlement terms were finally agreed upon, I drove home to my rental apartment, made myself a cup of coffee I didn't really want, and sat at the small kitchen table that didn't yet feel like mine. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that, the specific stillness that comes after closing a long, difficult file, when the work is done and there's nothing left to do except live inside the result. The divorce was finalized the following spring, almost exactly a year after the dinner where Diane's hands had stayed folded in her lap instead of reaching for mine. Trevor Ashby, as far as I ever learned, had ended things with Diane sometime during the custody evaluation, whether from his own discomfort with the legal scrutiny or some other reason. I never asked, and Diane never offered. I told myself I didn't care by then, and mostly, by then, I genuinely didn't. Emily moved in with me full-time that summer, with a standing arrangement for regular time with her mother that, eventually, both of us managed to make work without it curdling into the kind of bitterness I'd watched ruin other divorced families I'd known professionally and personally. It wasn't easy. There was a birthday that first year where the two schedules collided badly enough that everyone left frustrated, and a Thanksgiving that required more diplomacy than either Diane or I had any natural talent for. But it held, mostly, because Emily had made her preference clear early enough in the process that it became the frame everyone else had to build their plans around, rather than an afterthought negotiated at the very end, once everything else had already calcified. Diane and I see each other now mostly at school events and the occasional handoff in a parking lot that's gotten easier, by small degrees, with time. She sold her share of the proceeds from the house and moved into a condo across town. I heard, secondhand, through Emily, that she and Trevor never got back together after the divorce, that whatever it had been, it hadn't survived contact with consequences. I don't know if that's true. I've stopped needing to know. Emily is 16 now. She still does her geometry homework at the same kitchen table where I once laid out Patricia's report for her mother, though we've since replaced the table, because the old one started feeling like it belonged to a different chapter of the house entirely. She doesn't talk about the divorce much anymore. Once, last spring, she mentioned, almost in passing, that she was glad she told Dr. Marsh the truth, even though it had felt strange at the time, like she was choosing between her parents in a way she'd been taught her whole life not to do. You weren't choosing between us, I told her. You were just telling the truth about your own life. Those aren't the same thing, even if they feel like they should be. She nodded, the way she does when she's actually heard something instead of just agreeing to end a conversation, and went back to her homework. I thought I knew the shape of my marriage for most of the 19 years I was in it. I knew Diane's schedule, her travel patterns, the particular way she laughed when she was closing a difficult sale over the phone. Turns out there was a version of her, and a version of myself, that I'd never properly examined, because examining either one would have meant admitting that providing well and being present aren't actually the same thing, no matter how badly I wanted them to be, and that a marriage can look financially sound for years while the real ledger underneath it is already running a deficit nobody has bothered to audit. I spent the better part of a year looking for the single moment it had gone wrong. I finally understood there wasn't one. It had been a slow misallocation, the kind that doesn't show up on any balance sheet until somebody finally asks the right question of the right person, and in this case, the right person had been sitting at our dinner table the whole time, quietly keeping her own accurate books on who actually showed up. The most painful detail in this story isn't the storage unit, the hidden account, or even the 18 months Diane spent quietly building an exit she never told Robert about. It's the moment Carol Reyes opens negotiations asking for the house, the car, and half a pension, a request built entirely on the assumption that Emily was a fixed asset, certain to stay wherever her mother stayed, when in fact the one variable neither side had properly accounted for had already been decided, quietly, by a 14-year-old who'd been keeping her own accurate ledger the entire time. There's a temptation to read Diane simply as someone who got greedy in a settlement after getting caught in an affair. The story resists that reading, at least partly. Her financial hedging, the separate account, the small transfers accumulated over 18 months, wasn't only about Trevor Ashby. It was about a woman who'd spent years feeling overlooked for promotions, overlooked at home, and who'd quietly concluded, long before the affair became the headline, that she needed a version of security that didn't depend on a marriage she no longer fully trusted. That doesn't excuse the deception. But it explains something the asset fight alone doesn't. She wasn't only negotiating for money. She was negotiating, unconsciously, for proof that the life she'd be left with after the marriage ended would still look substantial enough to matter. What's striking is how precisely Robert's flaw mirrors the very dynamic he eventually exposes through the audit. He confused providing well with being present, the same way Diane confused having a separate financial cushion with having genuine security, both of them substituting a measurable, defendable asset for the harder, less quantifiable work of actually attending to the relationship in front of them. Robert tracked credit card statements for over a year before confronting his own wife. Diane built a parallel bank account for 18 months before ever considering what would happen if their daughter's loyalty turned out not to be something either of them could simply assume. Both treated the marriage, in their own ways, like an asset to be protected rather than a relationship requiring active attention, and both were eventually outmaneuvered by the one person in the house who had been paying the closest attention all along. This is where the story's real subject comes into focus. It isn't really about a hidden affair or a contested pension. It's about what happens when two adults spend years optimizing for financial and emotional self-protection while the child in the house quietly forms her own, far more accurate assessment of who actually shows up, and how little either parent's legal strategy accounts for the possibility that the child's judgment might simply override the entire framework they'd built their case around. Carol Reyes built a negotiating position assuming custody would follow tradition. Gerald Whitlow predicted fault wouldn't move the financial numbers much. Both predictions were partially undone by a single, clear statement from someone neither lawyer had fully reckoned with as an independent variable. There's something worth sitting with, too, in how the story handles the idea of fairness. Robert doesn't walk away from the settlement feeling triumphant, exactly. What he gets isn't vindication so much as an accounting that finally matches reality, a number, a custody arrangement, an outcome that reflects what actually happened rather than the version Diane tried to establish as the starting frame. That distinction matters more than the dollar amounts themselves. He didn't need to win. He needed the ledger to finally be read correctly, by someone other than himself. If this story reached you, it's probably because some part of it felt familiar, not necessarily the pension or the custody battle, but the quieter recognition that children in a fracturing household are rarely as passive as the adults around them assume. The question this story leaves you with isn't who deserved the house, the car, or the pension. It's simpler and harder than that. In your own life, who has actually been paying attention to who shows up, and have you been keeping that same ledger, or assuming someone else was keeping it for you?